Alright everyone, so today we're going to be doing a monthly Senate prediction. We're just going to put this as blue. For the 2020 election, presumably I'll be doing one more of these in October, and then maybe one last one in November, right before the election. Same with a final general election prediction before it really is the election. But anyway, we've just got some Senate seats to talk about here. All of the seats that are already filled out are safe for either party, and they're not going to change hands, probably no matter what happens. And we're going to be moving west to east here. So the first state we're going to start off with is the state of Alaska. We'll do Montana after that. If we go back to 2014, the last time this seat was up, Dan Sullivan won by 3.2%, unseating incumbent Democrat Mark Begich, who had held the seat for one term. This was during a red wave midterm election, however. This was not during a presidential, so turnout was much lower. But if we look at the last time a Senate seat was up during a presidential election, we would go back to 2016 with Lisa Murkowski. They do not have any borough results there, so there's no point clicking on it. And she won the seat fairly comfortably against two opponents, neither of which were Democrats, one a libertarian and one an independent, which is kind of like what Alaska does a lot of the time. Usually the opponent of the Republican is anything but the Republican, so it's everything and anything from the Green Party combined with the Libertarian, the Democrat, etc. So it's almost like a coalition type opposition there. But she won very comfortably. If we look, of course, we're not talking about Lisa Murkowski, though. We're talking about Dan Sullivan. A lot of the polls have this race all over the place, depending on which poll you go to. Some polls have the race relatively close. Some have it very, very distant, as in this one with a 13-point gap. I think it's safe to say, as of right now, Alaska's race is definitely probably likely for Dan Sullivan. I wouldn't say safe just because Alaska tends to be much weirder when it comes to their Senate races and not nearly as partisan as the rest of the country is. So I would say for right now it's probably going to be a likely margin against Al Gross. Again, Dan Sullivan is the incumbent. Also during a presidential election year, I think that in itself will be enough. What's interesting, though, is even though Dan Sullivan was running unopposed, he still got more raw votes than all of the Democratic, Libertarian, Independents candidates put together, which was very interesting. So that's going to be the state of Alaska. We're going to move on to the state of Montana. Of course, the last time Montana was up was 2014 when Steve Daines was not an incumbent. This was the first time he'd won the seat by 17 points during a red wave midterm, a pretty decisive victory, a safe margin in a very red state like Montana. However, Senate races and everything besides presidential races in Montana tends to get fairly close. Even their at-large House races, if we go back to 2016. See, even races like this, well, this one wasn't that close, 2018 I meant, but the at-large races can sometimes get very, very close. If we look at the polling out of the Montana Senate race here, Steve Daines has taken the lead again. Steve Bullock had his moment in the sun, I think, but as we get closer to the election, we're going to see that Steve Daines is going to gain more. I'm actually going to make quite a bolder prediction. I'm going to say this seat is going to go likely and not even lean anymore. Considering that Republicans usually overperform their polling averages in most states, and Montana is one of those states. I think at the end of the day, even though Steve Bullock is a somewhat popular governor, there's a very different perception in Montana between governors and senators and presidents. So that, I think, will definitely play into the race in Montana. Arizona is going to be probably one of the most hotly contested seats in the entire country in 2020. If we go back to 2014, there was no race. If we move on to Arizona, this is probably going to be one of the most hotly contested races in the country. There was no Senate race in 2014, so going back to 2016, the last time Arizona was up during a general, it was incumbent John McCain who won by 13 points over his Democratic opponent. Interestingly enough, John McCain was not a very popular senator when he ran for re-election in 2016. It was only really after his death that Arizona really became immersed in John McCainism and all things John McCain. But before that, it was a much different attitude. Most of the Republican base not liking Senator McCain. That, of course, has shifted after his death. But this was the last time Arizona was up during a presidential election, although we all know in 2018, Kyrsten Sinema did fairly well in the state. She won by 3 points in the midterms. Looking at the polling average now, something interesting to note, the Republican primary did have more raw votes than the Democratic primary, although Kelly was essentially running unopposed. It still goes to show you there are more Republicans in Arizona than Democrats. That does not mean Republicans are guaranteed to win by any sense. It just means there's more registered Republicans than Democrats. There's also a huge number of independents in the state as well. I don't know if they have closed or open primaries or not. But anyway, if we look at the ratings, nearly everyone has this seat flipping. Kelly is just up a monumental lead over McSally in a state that should be very, very close. It's not close in these polls. Fox News polls are not very accurate, but even if Kelly is only up a few points over McSally, it still bodes poorly for her, considering McSally hasn't led in any poll since June. And if you want to go where she's been consistently leading, you have to go back to 2019. She against Mark Kelly, she's hardly even been competitive, and the polling aggregate, I just think in this case, is insurmountable for her. McSally is not popular in the state. She lost in 2018. She's not viewed favorably by voters in Arizona from both sides of the aisle, funny enough, and that is going to go to her detriment. So we're going to put Arizona as leans Mark Kelly. I think it could still be maybe a 3-point victory for him, but it will be a victory. Regardless of which way Arizona goes in the presidential, I think it's basically a foregone conclusion that Mark Kelly is going to take this seat. Moving on to Colorado. So the last time Colorado had a Senate race, for Gardner anyway, was in 2014, the last time he was up for re-election. This is when he unseated incumbent Mark Udall by around 2.5 points. This only has 99% reporting, so the margin might have been slightly different. But nonetheless, it was like around a 2-point victory during a red wave year. Which goes to show you that when it was this close, Mark Udall was not necessarily an unpopular senator either. It just happened to be because of the blue wave. And of course, Gardner overperformed in places like El Paso County, Weld County, and these other more populous counties that tend to lean more Republican. And he did fairly well in the suburbs. He got the suburbs close enough to win. I think Jefferson County at the end of the day actually did go blue, but it was so narrow, it didn't really matter because Gardner eked out a victory. Now, if we look at, of course, the last time Colorado was up in the Senate at all was back in 2016 with Michael Bennet and his Republican opponent here. Now, the state of Colorado had went to Hillary Clinton by around 5 points, or 4.9 if we're going to be specific. But here for the Senate race, it's a more decisive victory here. Michael Bennet winning by around 5.7%. And again, Darrell Glenn's numbers are better in a lot of the more populous Republican counties, but again, his margins are not nearly as close as they need to be in the Denver suburbs. In fact, in some cases, Trump made it closer in the Denver suburbs, and ultimately that swung the race heavily to Michael Bennet. So, of course, if we look at the polling aggregate for the state of Colorado, which is currently held by Cory Gardner, what am I saying? We can see that most people have this race as leaning or tilting towards John Hickenlooper. It is interesting to note that a lot of the polls are by pretty wide margins, except this recent poll, and again, I have no clue how accurate this poll even is. But I don't think it's going to be a complete blowout for John Hickenlooper. I do think he's going to capture the seat. If we just look at the primary turnout, of course, the Democratic primary turnout literally dwarfs the Republican one. And I know the Republican one was uncontested, but it just goes to show you that the enthusiasm is on the Democrats. In fact, Hickenlooper got more votes than Cory Gardner did in his primary, and he only got 58% of the vote. So it really shows you that Democratic Coloradans really want Cory Gardner out, no matter what it seems. So we're going to put that race as leans Hickenlooper. I think at the end of the day, it's going to narrow, but I don't really see a situation where Cory Gardner is viable or where he can win this seat anymore. The next state we're going to be looking at is New Mexico, which you're probably wondering why I don't have this as a safe state for the Democrats, and I will explain why. If we go back to the 2012 Senate races, and the reason why you go back to 2012 is because this was a blue wave year, sort of. This was a blue year. Obama won in the presidential. And if we look at New Mexico, the Senate race is fairly close because we have a non-incumbent Democrat versus a non-incumbent Republican. And the margin was around 6 points for Mark Heinrich here, who was new. And a lot of the results are much closer in a lot of the counties than they were in the general election. If we just, well, we don't have to really look at that. But anyway, they are much closer. Of course, if we look at the polls from the New Mexican Senate race down here, it's no shock that a lot of people have this race as either likely or lean. I think personally this is not a safe race. However, I do think it's going to be likely for Ben Ray Lujan. He's not an incumbent. And this is a general election year where turnout is going to be higher, which is going to help the Democrat. If this was an off-year red midterm, let's say, if Biden was president in 2022 and there was a Senate race here, then it could be contested. But ultimately, I do think there's not much else to really say about New Mexico. I think it's going to be likely, but I don't think it's going to be safe. I would not be surprised if the margin was only 6 or 7 points due to the third-party vote of the share and also the fact that they're both non-incumbents and that incumbency advantage that would typically go to the Democrat is not there anymore. Moving on to the state of Kansas, we're not going to talk about Kansas all too much. If we go to the polling for the Kansas Senate race, it seems to be going to Roger Marshall somewhat narrowly. I think, though, it is not going to be as narrow as this. If we go to the last time this seat was up, it was in 2014 with Pat Roberts, who was actually a fairly unpopular senator. But again, he still won by 11 points. So despite all of that, he was still able to win pretty decisively. Again, not nearly as comfortably as Republicans are used to winning in Kansas, but still well enough. And of course, if we were to go to the last time a Kansas seat was up during the presidential, it was Senator Morin, and he won very, very decisively. But he was popular, and this is a completely open seat. And I think that this Chris Kobach kind of syndrome is going to wear off in the state of Kansas since he's not the nominee. I think it's going to be likely. It could be high single digits, but I think it's more likely that's going to be low double digits. I know the polling averages have it very close, but as we get closer to the election and the nominee is not Chris Kobach, it's Roger Marshall, it's going to widen because he's not the same type of Republican that Chris Kobach is. Texas is another Senate race we're not going to talk a whole lot about. It's not really that contested, just like Kansas, as the media likes to make it out. If we go back to the last time this seat was up, though, incumbent John Cornyn won a monumental landslide. This is this is what Republicans used to win in Texas at the beginning of the decade. These huge, nearly 30-point landslides, and Cornyn is not going to get anything like this in 2020 because the turnout is going to be very high, and a lot of these cities are going to be much, much bluer now with Trump on the ballot. For the Senate race in particular, Cornyn has been increasing in the polls, and so has his opponent, MJ Hagar, but Cornyn has not been down in any poll. He's been ahead in every poll. I think at the end of the day, the margin is going to be quite big for John Cornyn. I'm almost hesitant to put it as safe because it really doesn't seem like this race is really going to be contested. But we're going to put it as likely just for now. It's going to be just on the border of safe. It's going to be a pretty decisive win for Cornyn, and he really doesn't have to worry a whole lot about campaigning here. Moving on to Minnesota. If we go back to the last time this seat was up, nope. It was with Al Franken. Of course, Tina Smith is now the candidate, and he won during a red wave year by 11 points. Very impressive. If we go to the 2016 results for Minnesota in the presidential, it was fairly close, and Trump only lost the state by 1.5%. However, I think down-ballot Democrats will probably overperform Joe Biden in the state of Minnesota. regardless of who wins the state. And ultimately, I don't really think this state is that much in play. Tina Smith doesn't really have a notable challenger. We're going to put this as likely blue for now, although it could be moved down to lean depending on the circumstances of the race and as we get more information about it. Iowa, we're not going to talk a whole lot about. If we go back to 2014 here, I'm all over the place. 2014, Joni Ernst won this open seat by around 9 points. So pretty decisive victory. Again, it wasn't a presidential, it was an off-year midterm. The presidential one for Iowa we're not even going to look at because it was just a blowout because Chuck Grassley had been there since 1887, and he always wins by massive margins in the state of Iowa, so there's no really point in looking at that. But we are going to look at the polls for the state of Iowa and its race to see where it really stands. Polls are kind of all over the place, but Joni Ernst clearly is leading in more. Although Greenfield is up in the aggregate, I don't really see that staying. Although all the rankings have this as toss-up. I think it's safe personally to rank this Senate race as a lean Republican because Trump is going to carry the state of Iowa probably no matter what. Even if it is a few points, he's going to carry the state, and that down ballot effect might be enough to get Joni Ernst up. Again, Greenfield is not the strongest challenger they could have ran in the state, so they probably would have been better off picking the other Democrats, possibly. So there were 276,000 votes in the Democratic primary, 229,000. So this makes sense, honestly, because Joni Ernst is the incumbent, and Democrats are kind of fired up. So Democratic turnout is higher, which is sort of a red flag, but at the same time, the polls are so narrow, and Joni Ernst is probably going to continue to lead in future polls, as well as Trump carrying the state. I don't really see this seat really flipping. Moving on to Michigan, this is a really, really interesting race. This is another race, kind of like Arizona, Colorado, and Alabama, North Carolina, Maine, that people are really, really, really going to be watching on election night. So if we go back to 2014, the last time Gary Peters was up, he won by 13 points, a very comfortable margin during a red wave year, which goes to show you that the state of Michigan is loyal to its incumbent senators despite the trends during midterm years. And Gary Peters is the incumbent. If we look at we don't need 2012 anymore. If we look at the polling average for the state of Michigan, it has been getting very, very close. We have lean Democrat, likely. Both candidates seem to be dropping, but Gary Peters is barely up in the aggregate. Barely, barely up. He's only up by around 3.5. This is a seat that could be very competitive. I don't know if it'd be more competitive than the general, but I would not be surprised. John James could overperform President Trump possibly in this scenario. Now, I've put Michigan as lean in my September prediction. If you want to watch that, I could link it down below. But essentially, this race is going to be very, very, very close. And there's one poll that has John James up by Trafalgar, which basically nailed all of the Rust Belt predictions back in 2020. However, Gary Peters is still the incumbent. He still has the advantage. If we look at primary turnout, the Republican primary had 1 million votes. The Democratic primary still had a higher turnout because there are more registered Democrats than Republicans in the state of Michigan. That's just the case. This race is going to go down to the wire. As of right now, I'd say this race is tilt for Gary Peters, and the reason why I make it so narrow is because the race seems to be narrowing. As of right now, I think Gary Peters will narrowly eke out a victory. If John James really wanted to run again in 2024 or something like that, he'd probably definitely win the seat. Of course, that's assuming that Trump loses the 2020 election. If he wins, John James' Senate ambitions are probably done for. But if he's going to win the Senate, this would be the year he would do it. However, I think Gary Peters will hang on. Moving down to Kentucky, we're not going to talk about Kentucky much. Again, this is another state that people are making seem way closer than it actually is. If we look back at 2014 in this race, another race people thought Mitch McConnell was vulnerable. He won by 16 points, fairly decisive, a safe margin in a safe red state. If we go to the polling for the state of Kentucky, The Democrat, of course, had more enthusiasm. That's no surprise. Most voters in the state of Kentucky, by the way, are registered Democrats and are not registered Republicans, despite the state being so red. However, McGrath is seemingly falling off whatever advantage she had. She was never up in the polls. McConnell was always up, and he seems to be increasing his lead over McGrath. The latest poll, he's up by 12 points. I think it's safe to say that this seat is likely, if not safe, Republican. For the sake of this video, we'll just leave it as likely, McConnell winning by a high double-digit or low single-digit number. I really can't I can't really see the result differing that much from the presidential, but I think Trump will overperform Mitch McConnell. Moving on to the state of Alabama. This is another state that's going to be very contested because the incumbent Senator Doug Jones won in a special election against an alleged pedophile, Roy Moore, and that was back in 2017. If we look at the 2020 polls for the state of Alabama, there is not a single poll where, that's the primary. There's not a single poll where Doug Jones is leading or fairly even close. The latest one, the closest poll, is from June, which has the two around 3 points different of each other, and another poll in May that shows a similar result. This is probably going to be a safe Republican state. I don't even entertain the idea of lean or likely. Even though Doug Jones is above water in the state of Alabama, this state is going to go to Trump overwhelmingly, and it's going to go to Tommy Tuberville overwhelmingly. So I'm going to put this as safe. I think it's safe to assume that this is going to be a pretty big blowout for Tuberville with Trump on the ballot. Had Trump not been on the ballot, it might have been a little more contested, but I think the Republican was going to win this no matter if it was Jeff Sessions or not. Georgia is having 2 Senate elections. One special election, so we'll be taking a look at both of those in the polling aggregate. First, we'll take a look at the regular Senate election between David Perdue and Jon Ossoff. If we go down to the polls here, they are actually very, very close. Perdue is up by 4 in the Real Clear Politics average, and Ossoff is above in the 270 to win average. 270 to win, I don't really find that reliable because they put a lot of outlier polls there that really don't deserve to even be in the aggregate. But Georgia has gotten a whole lot closer than I thought it would be for this Senate race, which bodes very poorly for David Perdue. However, the good news is he is still up in the polls. Ossoff is barely up in the polls. I don't know how long this is going to last, but it appears due to the polling average and how close it is, I'll have to downgrade the race. I usually have this race as likely. I'll probably put it as lean now. The Democratic primary having slightly more higher turnout than the Republican, although David Perdue is the incumbent and running unopposed. We're going to put this race as lean Republican just for now. It looks like Perdue's going to eke out a smaller victory than previously thought. I previously thought he'd win by around 6 or 7, but apparently that's not the case. The race has gotten a whole lot closer. Now we're going to be analyzing the special election, which is a jungle primary. The real race won't be decided until January of 2021. So there's 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans running, and I think there's a whole lot more than that. But a lot of the polls have both Republicans higher than the Democrats, which is good news for the Republicans. If Doug Collins is the nominee, it definitely bodes well for him, but he's been doing worse. This race, ironically enough, actually might be more safe or in the Republicans' hands than for David Perdue. And the reason why that is because this race is going to be held in January. Given that 1 Republican and 1 Democrat win the jungle primary when it's all said and done, I would actually rate this race as a likely, since it's going to be an off year. So I've almost reversed the roles, because this is going to be a race held in January 2021, and there's always much lower turnout. There was a similar scenario to this back in 2008. There was a Senate race in Georgia that neither candidate got 50%, but it was around a 3-point margin a victory for the Republican. It went bound to January, and the margin was like almost 20 points. So I could put it as safe, but that would be very arrogant. I don't know who's going to win. So we'll analyze that race as it gets closer. North Carolina is another super hotly contested Senate race. If we go back to 2014, the last time Thom Tillis was up for election, he unseated incumbent Senator Kay Hagan by around 2 points during a red wave year. But she performed very well for a Democrat during a red wave, probably because she was the incumbent, particularly in places like Wake County, Charlotte, Fayetteville, Greensboro, basically all the urban centers and these majority black counties up here. Tillis performing well basically everywhere else in the state, although some of these counties in western North Carolina are going to be a lot redder this time, but contrary, these are also going to be a lot bluer. So really we have to look at polling to decide. Also, whoever wins the state of North Carolina in 2020 will probably affect the Senate race, and if we look at the aggregate now, Cunningham is up, and he's only been increasing his lead on Tillis. Oh my goodness, yeah, Tillis hasn't led outright in a poll since June, which is very, very bad news for him. He's actually been kind of falling off here, while Cunningham has been rising. So it looks like Cunningham has the edge in this race, even though Democrats oversample Republicans. When it comes to polling, Democrats are oversampled in North Carolina. Tillis is not very popular, and the enthusiasm seems to have been there in the primary as it completely blew the numbers out of the water for the Republican primary. I don't know what the reasons, if they were held on different days or not, but regardless, this is bad news for Tillis. This race, as of today, I'm going to put as tilt Cal Cunningham. Unless anything changes, of course, we still have a few months. But right now, the polls look very bad for Tillis. Very, very bad. Not nearly as bad as for Martha McSally, who is almost, at this point, certainly going to lose her race. But still pretty bad. Virginia, we're not going to talk a whole lot about at all. The last time this seat was up, Mark Warner was the incumbent. He barely held on to his seat to challenger Ed Gillespie, who would later go on to run for governor in 2017 and lose to Ralph Northam. But this race was very, very close. A low turnout election. The suburbs got very, very close. As of course we're going to see during the presidential, the suburbs are not at all close. If we go to 2016, for instance, and we go to Virginia, which did not have a Senate race in 2016, these suburbs are a lot bluer, and I only expect them to get even bluer because they don't seem to be trending in any other way. But anyway, we can look at the polls for this Virginia race. Keep in mind, Mark Warner is a very popular senator in the state of Virginia and is running against an unknown Republican, Daniel Gade, who I don't really think has a large national profile in the state. If we look at I don't think the Democrats even had a primary. But again, the polling is abysmal for Daniel Gade. This race is going to be safe. I just figured I'd talk about it. He's probably going to win similarly to a margin that Tim Kaine won in 2018, which is around 17 points, which is what I expect Warner to win by. It's not going to be as much of a blowout as his 2008 victory where he won by almost 30, but he certainly will win by double digits, no doubt. This is not going to be contested in any way. New Hampshire, we're not going to talk too much about because it's not very contested. If we go to the 2014 Senate race, Jeanne Shaheen barely won over Scott Brown, who was actually the senator from Massachusetts and their nominee in 2010 and 2012, and then moved to New Hampshire to run for this seat as well. But Jeanne Shaheen held on. She bucked the red wave year. If we look at polls out of the state of New Hampshire, it's not at all really contested. The Republican has not even been close at any poll. Jeanne Shaheen is going to win this seat by a safe margin. I don't really see that changing. So Jeanne Shaheen is going to win this race by a safe margin. I don't really see that changing due to that information. Finally, that brings us to the last state on our list, the state of Maine. This state could ultimately decide the makeup of the Senate. and could either, if we give it to the Democrats, make it a 50-50 tie. If we give it to the Republicans, no matter who wins the presidency, Republicans keep the Senate. So Republicans only need to win one of these states that flipped. If Republicans lose Iowa, they're screwed. If they lose any of the Georgia seats, they're screwed out of a majority. But Arizona, assuming they're going to lose that already, assuming they're going to lose Colorado, North Carolina, Michigan, and assuming they win Iowa, hold on to Texas and Georgia, Montana, Alaska, then that puts us at 50-49. So let's really break down the Maine Senate race. The last time Susan Collins was up for election, she won by an astounding nearly 40-point margin of victory. This race was a complete blowout. But again, Susan Collins had the reputation of a moderate in 2014. Trump was not an issue. And this was an off-year election. But if we go back to 2008, a state that overwhelmingly went to Obama, it also overwhelmingly went to Susan Collins. However, it is interesting to note, it is something to note, that Susan Collins went from the most to the least popular senator in the country, or one of the least popular senators. If we go to 2016, the state of Maine was relatively close, for Maine standards anyhow. I don't expect Maine to be this close this time around. I think Biden's going to win Maine pretty handily. Even though the state as a whole is trending more Republican, I think this election is going to buck that trend, and Biden is going to win Maine. I don't really think Trump has a chance there, and he's not really putting a whole lot of resources in it either. And if finally we're going to go to the 2020 Maine polls to see the state of the race there. Of course, if we go to the primary, more noise in the Democratic primary, no doubt. Susan Collins winning her primary very decisively, but still getting less votes than Sarah Gideon. And finally, if we go down to the general, this race is fairly close. However, Sarah Gideon has the advantage by around 5 points. Both of them have seemed to be falling off, but Susan Collins had the lead in this entire race until the beginning of 2020, in which that lead started to kind of fade away. The vote to acquit Trump and the Kavanaugh vote definitely hurts Susan Collins in the blue state of Maine. And the polling aggregates have Sarah Gideon up very comfortably. However, Susan Collins is a very formidable force in the state of Maine, and for that reason, I'm going to put this race in Sarah Gideon's column tilt, but it's going to be a down-to-the-wire Senate race, no doubt. So now we officially have a tied Senate, which means whichever party wins the presidency will control the Senate. However, it's not all in doom and gloom for Republicans, because all they need is one Democratic vote, particularly maybe a Joe Manchin, a Kyrsten Sinema, or a Mark Kelly, to jump ship and vote with them to get whatever they want done. So it's not really going to be a decisive Senate victory for either party, but this is the way I see it turning out in November. Anyway, that is all for today, guys. Thank you for watching this video. Please like this video, comment, and subscribe to the channel. I'll be working on more in-depth state predictions and House predictions, so stay tuned for those. And thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.